My name is Mary, and I cooked, I cleaned, I sacrificed for them, and still they treated me like dirt. From the very first day, my in-laws made it clear I wasn't welcome. Whispered insults behind my back, stolen credit for my work, constant disrespect from the moment I entered their home. All because I didn't fit their idea of status, because in their eyes, I wasn't good enough for their precious son. At first, I thought I could ignore it. At first, I told myself love would protect me. But when you're surrounded by people who despise you, when every meal you cook is turned into a weapon, every gesture of kindness twisted into weakness, that belief starts to rot. And slowly, I realized they weren't just attacking me. They were breaking me down piece by piece, trying to erase me from my own marriage. They poisoned my husband's mind, turned him against me, and suddenly the man I once loved more than anything was looking at me with suspicion, with disgust, as though I were the enemy. But here's the thing. When you've lost everything, when they've stripped you of your dignity and your love, you discover a new kind of strength. I didn't break, I planned. And one day, I would take back everything they thought they owned. When I first married my husband, I was so in love that I believed love alone could conquer every storm. He was charming, ambitious, with the kind of smile that made me forget every warning sign. My parents told me his family was traditional. That was their polite way of saying judgmental, rigid, and obsessed with appearances. I thought if I worked hard, if I respected them, if I showed them I was worthy of their son, eventually they'd accept me. You know when you walk into a room and feel the temperature drop because of who you are? That's what it felt like from day one. My mother-in-law's eyes would sweep over me like I was a stain on her polished floors. My father-in-law barely acknowledged me, unless it was to criticize. And my sisters-in-law, they didn't even try to hide their contempt. They'd whisper and laugh as I passed by, little daggers disguised as giggles. At first, I brushed it off. Newly married, still glowing, I told myself they'd come around. I stayed quiet when they insulted my cooking, when they compared me to the women from better families. I thought silence would prove my patience, that humility would earn me respect. Instead, it became an invitation for more cruelty. The chores piled onto me like punishment. Every morning, I was the first to wake, the last to sleep, my hands raw from scrubbing, my back aching from bending over floors and laundry. They'd host dinners and parties, and I'd spend days preparing meals that were praised, until my mother-in-law would take the credit, smiling at her guests as though she had slaved in the kitchen. My husband would sit there, oblivious, too proud of his mother to notice my swollen feet or trembling hands. And when I finally dared to complain, just once, he silenced me. Don't make drama. Drama! As though being treated like a servant in my own home was some petty inconvenience, as though my pain was noise to be shut down. It wasn't just the chores. It was the way they erased me. When relatives visited, they'd leave me out of introductions. When decisions were made about the house, about finances, I was invisible. Even the smallest things, a photo frame, a piece of furniture, a holiday plan, they would make choices without me. Imagine being alive, breathing in the same house, and feeling like a ghost. But the real betrayal came slowly, like poison seeping into water. They began whispering to my husband. I didn't hear every word, but I felt the shift. His eyes grew colder, his patience shorter. He'd come home from work already irritated, already ready to find fault in me. If I said the table wrong, if I looked tired, if I forgot something small, he'd snap. And the whispers behind closed doors, they became accusations in his mouth. My family says you're lazy. Lazy. I was breaking my body every day to keep their household running, and somehow I was lazy? My family says you're ungrateful. Ungrateful. I had given up my comfort, my independence, my freedom, and still it was never enough. And the cruelest part is he believed them. The man who once held me close at night, who promised to protect me, who said I was his world, he began to look at me like a burden, like a mistake he needed to correct. There were nights I'd cry into my pillow, muffling the sound so no one would hear, because even my pain was ammunition for them. I'd remember the girl I used to be, hopeful, laughing easily, dreaming big. Where had she gone? She was buried under piles of laundry, lost in the kitchen smoke, suffocated by contempt. But here's where things started to change. Somewhere between the tears and the exhaustion, a thought began to grow inside me. What if they were underestimating me? What if the very silence they mocked was the weapon I could use? Because while they whispered and schemed, I started listening. I started watching. I started collecting every insult, every manipulation, every lie. They thought they were breaking me down, but what they were really doing was giving me a front row seat to their corruption, their greed, their hypocrisy. And while my husband turned colder, I realized something terrifying and liberating at the same time. I couldn't save him from them, not anymore. He had chosen their side. But me? I still had choices. And one day soon, I would make the choice that would change everything. Tell me, if you were in my shoes, watching your own husband slip through your fingers because his family couldn't stand the thought of you being his equal, what would you have done? Would you keep begging for scraps of respect? Or would you start planning your payback in silence? The more I tried to hold my marriage together, the faster it slipped away from me. My husband wasn't just distant anymore. He was cruel. There's no other word for it. The whispers from his family became his truth, and he treated me like their servant instead of his wife. He'd come home from work and immediately start inspecting, like I was an employee who had failed her duties. If the laundry wasn't folded the way his mother liked it, he'd scold me. If the food wasn't seasoned exactly to his father's taste, he'd push the plate away in disgust. And if I dared to answer back, even gently, his eyes would darken and he'd spit out words that cut deeper than knives. You'll never be good enough. Do you know how it feels to hear those words from the man who once swore you were everything? It's like being stabbed with your own memories. I'd replay the times he held my hand, the way he looked at me on our wedding day, and wonder, was that love even real? Or had I none more than a convenience, a placeholder, until his family found a way to erase me? My in-laws, though, they thrived on it. Every fight was fuel for them. I'd catch their satisfied smirks when my husband snapped at me in front of them. My mother-in-law once leaned over, her voice dripping with poison, and whispered, "See, even he's waking up to who you really are." And then she'd walk away, her heels clicking like victory drums against the tile. But the most humiliating moment came during one of their family gatherings. Relatives filled the house, laughter echoing from the living room, while I slaved in the kitchen. I carried trays of food out, sweating, exhausted, desperate for at least one word of appreciation. And then, in front of everyone, my sister-in-law said, "Mary's finally useful for something. Look at her. She's like the maid we never had to hire." The room erupted in laughter. Even my husband, yes, even he laughed with them. I stood there, my face burning, my heart cracking open in front of a room full of people who enjoyed watching me bleed. Do you know that kind of humiliation, where you want the floor to open up and swallow you whole? That was the moment something inside me shifted. I stopped crying that night. For the first time in months, I didn't let the tears fall. I just laid there in the dark, staring at the ceiling, my mind buzzing. If they wanted me to break, they would never get that satisfaction. And if they thought I was too weak, too small, too insignificant to fight back, well, they had no idea who they were dealing with. But planning revenge isn't something you do overnight. It starts small, with whispers in your own head. At first, I just imagined it. What if I exposed their hypocrisy? What if the relatives who adored them saw the truth? What if my husband discovered that his precious family wasn't as pure as he thought? Those thoughts were like sparks in the darkness, and I clung to them to survive. Meanwhile, the cruelty escalated. My in-laws controlled everything. Money, decisions, even the way my husband and I spent time together. My mother-in-law would knock on our bedroom door at night just to check if I'd done the laundry. My sisters-in-law borrowed my clothes without asking, then mocked me when they didn't fit them right. My father-in-law, always so stern, started dropping hints about how my husband deserved better. And my husband, he repeated their words back to me, almost word for word, as if their voices had replaced his own. One evening, after another screaming match that left me trembling, he said the words that shattered whatever hope I had left. "Maybe I made a mistake marrying you." He said it casually, like he was talking about a broken appliance, not a living, breathing woman who gave him everything. And my in-laws, they sat there, nodding in agreement, like a jury that had just handed down a verdict. But what they didn't know was that in that very moment, while they believed they had crushed me for good, I was already thinking 3 steps ahead. You see, I'd started keeping records. Quietly, patiently. Whenever they insulted me, I wrote it down. Whenever they manipulated my husband, I noted the details. When they twisted money or stole credit for my work, I kept evidence. Photos, receipts, voice recordings on my phone tucked into an apron pocket. They thought I was silent because I was weak, but silence is a powerful weapon when you know how to use it. Still, the hardest part wasn't gathering evidence, it was surviving each day. I learned to wear a mask. On the outside, I played the obedient daughter-in-law, bowing my head, saying yes, pretending their cruelty didn't touch me. Inside, I was burning. But my mask gave me freedom, because while they believed they'd won, I was free to watch, to learn, to prepare. And let me tell you something. When you're planning revenge, patience becomes your greatest ally. I knew I couldn't lash out too soon. I couldn't scream, couldn't fight, couldn't show my hand. Because revenge isn't just about getting even. It's about making sure they feel every ounce of pain they inflicted, multiplied tenfold, with nowhere to escape.
Tell me, if your own husband told you that marrying you was a mistake, would you still fight for him? Or would you start fighting for yourself? They were so sure they had me boxed in that they stopped watching the corners. They stopped thinking the quiet woman at the stove was anything but predictable. That's when I started moving. Not with fireworks or shouting, but with careful, low, steady steps that would one day look like a line of dominoes someone else set up for me. I began to build things they couldn't see. Evidence, small alliances, and a life outside their narrative. I found my first ally in the most unlikely place, the school where my neighbor's niece studied. She was a young teacher, new to town, the kind of person who notices details because she has to. Kids don't learn unless someone pays attention. One day, while returning a stray lunchbox that had been left in our yard, she saw me stacking paperwork on the kitchen counter. Receipts, envelopes, photocopies of warranties, and bills. She didn't flinch at my tired hands. She leaned in and said, almost gently, "You shouldn't be doing this alone." I didn't tell her everything that first afternoon. I let her see enough. The piles of unpaid utility notices that contradicted the family's boasts of wealth. The letter from a contractor the in-laws had sent back unpaid. My handwritten notes of conversations. She offered to help me digitize things, to organize the chaos into something a judge or bank could understand. Her name was Aisha, and she became the first person who treated me like a person, not a servant. Having one person in the world who saw you matters more than you think. With Aisha, I began to tidy the facts into a story that could be proven. I set up a small hidden folder on my phone where I saved photos of bills that disappeared from the drawer, screenshots of online bank accounts when I could access them, recordings, yes, recordings, of conversations where my mother-in-law pretended to praise me while later telling relatives she'd never allow someone like me to own anything in the house. I am not proud of recording people in secret, but when your life is at stake and their words are weapons, a voice memo becomes a shield. There were close calls. Do you know how your heart races when someone almost finds out your secret? There was one night my husband's cousin, a nosy man with a reputation for snooping, decided to clean our bedroom while we were at work. He opened my bottom drawer, the very drawer where I kept copies of contracts and the one receipt that proved the in-laws had siphoned money from the joint account. I had hidden it behind a stack of old newspapers, thinking nothing of the habit of saving things. He almost found it. He almost saw the receipt that would prove my side of the story. I lay awake that night and did what I'd been doing for months. I replayed the moment and made new plans. The cousin found nothing, and he left humming some tune, oblivious. Obliviousness was my currency now. I also had to learn to play the part convincingly. If you're going to survive among vultures, you must appear not worth the trouble. So I laughed at the right lines, nodded when I should, and let them belittle me publicly while I built my case privately. It's a strange kind of performance, smiling with a mouth that's breaking on the inside. Sometimes I'd go to the market and practice that smile in the reflection of a shop window, imagining the moment their laughter would curdle when everything I'd saved for months slid into a courtroom file or an auditor's inbox.
At the same time, the house got nastier. They doubled down on humiliation as if that could erase my quiet work. My mother-in-law began my bait me with money. Small sums she'd lend me and then shame me for having to accept. She would leave envelopes on the counter with a note, "For your little expenses." Then she'd make a show of noting every rupee I spent, turning charity into a public ledger of shame. My husband joined in on some level, keeping a running commentary on my purchases as if naming them made them immoral. "You didn't need that," he'd say, his tone casual, the kind of casual that's designed to wound. I'd bite my tongue and add the date and receipt to the folder. The real turning point in my plan came after I discovered a pattern in their bookkeeping that I almost missed. Several maintenance checks made out to a company that didn't exist. They were writing checks to a ghost, a small window of money that, if followed, would lead to the heart of their lies. I spent nights tracing bank statements, copying check numbers, photographing checks before they were shredded. I learned how to read their language, how they hid payments to avoid taxes, how they moved money into accounts in my husband's name but controlled by them. It was ugly and exhilarating at the same time because for the first time in months, I felt like I was the one with the map. But having evidence and knowing how to use it are two different things. I needed legal help, and legal help costs money. That's where my next risk came in, asking for outside help without letting them know. I started with the smallest thing, an anonymous tip to a local legal aid clinic describing the financial discrepancies in generic terms. They called back, asked for documents, and I slid them the photocopies I'd been maintaining through a discreet drop-off at a public library copier. It was clunky, risky, and perfect. They couldn't trace it back to me unless someone found the scrap of paper with my handwriting and the date. They accepted the file and called me in for a confidential consultation. I told them the story without theatrics, served only the facts, and watched their faces shift from skepticism to concern. Favorable nods are rare in legal offices. I felt the weight of professionals starting to understand the abuse I'd been living under. Meanwhile, my husband unraveled in other ways. He drank more. The pressure of choosing between his family and his wife was a slow burn he couldn't control. Sometimes he'd come home smelling of alcohol, aggressive in small ways, throwing plates, slamming doors.
Other times he'd be contrite for a day, remembering us like a hazy photograph he wanted to keep in his wallet. His inconsistency became another weapon I recorded, a voicemail left slurring apologies, texts that turned loving words into accusations, each one another stitch in my case. People think marriage problems are private, but when someone weaponizes private to control you, private becomes evidence. There was one night I almost lost everything. My mother-in-law found my hidden folder. I still remember the way she stood in the doorway, eyes scanning the scattered papers, the receipts, the labeled envelopes. My heart dropped like a stone into a well. She picked up a sheet, read a number, and her face altered. I watched her realize she was discovered. She looked at me like a cat who found its mouse trying to run. For a breathless second, I expected her to shriek, to tear the documents, to drag me into the living room and humiliate me in front of everyone. Instead, she folded the paper and walked away with a smile that wasn't a smile. That night, she didn't talk to me about what she'd found. Instead, she played normal, as if she'd found my grocery list. That calm terrified me more than rage would have. It meant she now knew I was dangerous. It meant the game had changed. I needed a new plan. I doubled down on secrecy. I made copies of everything and hid them in places no one would look. Inside a baby shoe at the charity box, wrapped in a sari stitch, in the lining of an old cookbook I donated to the library. Paranoia becomes practicality when you have to survive. Every time I tucked a receipt away, I felt a little more like myself, like the woman who might stand in court and say, "This is what you did," and be believed. And there were small victories too, little moments that tasted like sugar on a dry tongue. Aisha managed to get one of the contractor's unpaid invoices cross-checked. A legal aid volunteer confirmed that there were irregularities worth investigating. A nervous cousin, someone who had grown tired of the family's cruelty but feared speaking up, quietly gave me a statement about overheard conversations. Each of these things was a thread. Alone, they seemed flimsy. Together, they formed a rope. Do you ever think about what you would do if you were watched and judged every day, if every move you made could be turned into evidence of your shame? Would you hide, or would you collect the truth like a weapon? I chose the truth, because sometimes truth, when relentless, is the only thing that can break a lie. The pressure built, the walls pressed in, and yet with the pressure came a clarity I hadn't felt in years. I could see the shape of the endgame. I could picture the moment when I would stop being the woman who cooked and start being the woman who claimed what was hers. The plan wasn't finished. The stakes got higher every day. But for the first time in a long time, I could almost taste victory. Bitter, yes, but sweet enough to keep me going. They thought they had already finished me off, so when the first papers arrived, it felt like a small, impossible miracle. And then the reality of it hit like a truck. The Legal Aid Center called me in and handed me documents. A list of evidence requests, forms to authorize a forensic audit, and a tentative date for mediation. It was the first time I saw my name on a formal paper that didn't reduce me to maid or help. It said, Mary, complainant. I don't think I've ever read anything that made me feel lighter and more terrified at the same time. Lighter because finally someone had taken me seriously. Terrified because once the law is involved, everything becomes public. And in my family, public means more humiliation if you lose and worse if you win. We moved like thieves in daylight. The legal team, 2 women with crisp hijabs and no-nonsense eyes, explained how subpoenas worked, how bank audits could trace ghost companies, how testimonies would matter more than tears. They told me to expect intimidation. They told me to expect lies. Mostly, they told me to expect my in-laws to fight dirty. I nodded like I'd already planned for that. I had. But no amount of planning inoculates you against fear. The first move was to secure the most fragile pieces of evidence. Original receipts, a ledger my father-in-law thought he'd burned, and the recording of my mother-in-law boasting about hiding money. We had to copy everything and give it to the clinic while keeping originals safe. Aisha volunteered to be my shadow for a week, at first under the pretense of teaching a class nearby, but really to help me run copies and courier paperwork. Her presence was a small revolution. When she walked into the house, my mother-in-law's eyelids flicked like shutters, trying to close. She hated that I wasn't alone anymore. As the legal team filed motions, I also started the quieter, more personal part of the plan, cracking my husband's armor. He'd become more volatile, more suspicious, but also strangely careless when he wanted to prove his independence from me. He began to drink in company, to pick fights that he thought would put me in my place. I started responding differently. Where once I had pleaded, now I asked him questions that opened him up. Subtle, surgical. "Why do you repeat what they say?" I'd ask, voice calm. "How does it feel to watch your own wife be spoken about like a stranger?" He'd shrug or yell or leave, but seeds were planted. In private moments, when the house was quiet and the alcohol had softened his edges, I let one thin thread of truth slip in. "Do you remember that time you signed that check without asking me?" His face would go slack, or he'd change the subject. I was careful. No accusations, just reminders that his name was tied to things he didn't understand. It was a risk. It was necessary. They retaliated, hard and fast. My mother-in-law started a campaign of small cruelties turned public. She'd plant stories with relatives about my supposed petty thefts, spreading rumors that I'd taken money from the household. She'd show guests texts I'd once sent in confidence and twist them into admissions of guilt. Word travels fast in our neighborhood, and soon even women at the market avoided my gaze. The clinic told me to ignore it, to let the evidence speak. But gossip is a weight you carry until the day it isn't your burden anymore. Then came the night I feared most. Someone broke into our home. It was blatant, clumsy, a window pried, drawers rifled through. My hidden shoe with the copied receipts had been moved. My stomach dropped into a hollow that had no name. Whoever had been in our house had searched where I hid things. My first thought was fury. The second was cold calculation. This wasn't vandalism. It was intimidation. A message. Stop. My husband pretended he had slept through the noise. He had not. He smelled of someone else's cigarette and lied until his voice strained. I kept my face calm, but inside, the terror almost swallowed me. I called the clinic. They told me to go to the police. The police came, wrote notes, and suggested mediation as a best family solution. Their hands were slick with complacency. It was clear that the law, while a sword, was still obligated to tiptoe around family honor. The worst part, the part that made me feel like a child again, was how quickly my husband hardened after the break-in. He started to believe my careless behavior had invited trouble. "If you hadn't been so secretive," he said once, flinging the words like bullets, "this wouldn't be happening." He was trying to gaslight the fear itself into me. It almost worked. Almost. But the break-in also made one thing clear. They were afraid of me. Only fear drives people to steal documents and ransack drawers in the middle of the night. Fear meant I had power. That knowledge steadied me enough to move forward. We pressed on. The legal aid filed an emergency motion requesting temporary custody of certain financial accounts and an injunction to prevent the destruction of documents. It felt like asking a judge to believe in a ghost story, but the paperwork bore my careful fingerprints. Receipts with dates, voice recordings, statements from reluctant cousins. We laid the rope tight. The in-laws turned to bribery and manipulation. My father-in-law called old business partners, creating a web of lie upon lie to discredit the auditors. My mother-in-law offered hush money to a cousin who had already given me a statement, a quiet envelope left at a market stall with a note that began, "Think about your family." I watched that cousin take the envelope and then avoid my eyes for days. I cursed until my throat hurt.
I wished for public confession, for someone to stand and say they were paid to keep quiet. Instead, I had to accept that bot silence is a reality, and I'd have to build my case without every witness. One of the most terrifying moments came when the clinic informed me the bank had frozen the account we'd flagged, but only temporarily. The auditors needed more documents, original signatures, something to prove intent rather than a mistaken payment. That missing check, the one my husband's cousin almost found months ago, had turned into the most important piece of the puzzle. If it was lost or shredded, the auditors might not have enough. Panic pressed on my chest like a hand. I retraced my steps, the same way one might retrace memories to find a missing child. I went through drawers, old suitcases, the lining of donated dresses. I called Aisha and asked her to check her copied files. She found a scanned backup on a dusty old USB she'd forgotten to bring when she moved apartments. It was there. The number, the date, the scribble in my father-in-law's handwriting. I wept in the clinic's waiting room, not from relief, but from the unbearable weight of what had almost been taken from me. As the legal wheels turned, whispers outside the house became louder. Relatives asked if we were really going to court. My husband vacillated between anger and sorrow, sometimes telling my mother-in-law he felt trapped, and sometimes saying to me, with a voice that could break, "I don't want our family torn apart." He didn't get to decide whether the family would be torn apart. They chose that the moment they made me the villain instead of the wife. Still, his wavering handed me opportunities. I learned to speak plainly, to show him documents one at a time, to ask him to look at a check, to point to a text, and say, "These are your words." The more he read, the more doubt worked at him like a slow leak.
The day the auditors came, the house was a masquerade. My mother-in-law arranged for friends to be present, for the house to smell of roses and incense, a theater of respectability. The auditors moved through rooms with clipboards and patients, asking questions I'd hoped they would. My husband hovered behind them like a man hoping to be exonerated by someone else's pen. My mother-in-law's smile never left her face, but it trembled at the edges. For 2 hours, I smiled the smile I'd practiced for months, the one that said nothing but gave everything away. The auditors requested account statements, traced check numbers, and photographed faded ledger pages. When they left, Aisha squeezed my hand under the table and mouthed, "We got more than we needed." I wanted to laugh, but the sound lodged in my throat. The period between the audit and the court date was the worst. Threats ramped up into near violence. A car followed me once after I left for an appointment, headlights in the rear view like a pair of eyes. I changed routes, I met people in public, never walked alone at night. My mother-in-law started showing up unannounced with groceries and notes that read like apologies, but tasted like trapdoors. "For the family," she'd say, sliding a bag across the counter. I knew better. I began carrying copies of everything in a sealed envelope in my bag at all times. It felt ridiculous and necessary. And yet, even as they tightened the pressure, cracks appeared in their armor. A cousin who'd been paid to stay quiet suddenly confessed to a neighbor in a drunken stupor, an admission that a recording captured, and that recording found its way into our files. Another relative, tired of being complicit, agreed to testify about overheard conversations where my mother-in-law discussed hiding assets. It was dizzying, hope and fear braided together, but it was real. As the court date approached, the house felt like a vessel waiting to explode. My husband's face had a permanent pallor like someone who had stopped sleeping. My mother-in-law's composure grew brittle. The night before the hearing, she cornered me in the kitchen, voice honeyed and cold. "You don't have to make this ugly, Mary," she said. "We can solve this quietly." I looked at her, at the woman who'd never cooked a meal herself and who had once laughed at me while guests ate my food, and felt nothing but a cold, clean clarity. "No," I said. "I want the truth." She laughed then, a sound that didn't reach her eyes. and walked away. The next morning, I stood outside the courthouse, my palms damp, breath shallow. I thought of every time I'd been dismissed, every plate I had carried, every insult that had been flung like confetti. I thought of the documents tucked into folders that could make a judge see them for what they were. Not family disputes, but calculated theft, coercion, and cruelty. I put a hand to my chest and felt my heart steady. Whatever happened next, I had already started to change the story. The endgame was in sight. The dominoes were set. All that remained was to see which would fall first. The courthouse was colder than I expected, not in temperature, but in atmosphere, like the walls themselves had absorbed the weight of broken promises and families ripped apart. My name was called, Mary, complainant, and I stood, my knees threatening to buckle, but my back straighter than it had been in years. The judge's eyes flicked over me, then to the stack of files in front of him, and in that moment, I realized this wasn't about sympathy. This was about facts. Cold, documented, undeniable facts. And thank God I had them. My in-laws entered like royalty attending a pageant. My mother-in-law wore a cream suit with pearls that seemed to choke her rather than adorn her. My father-in-law adjusted his tie like the world owed him a bow. My husband walked behind them, his steps hesitant, as though unsure which side of the aisle he belonged on. He wouldn't even meet my eyes. That hurt more than I can explain. But I kept my face neutral, refusing to give them the satisfaction of seeing me break. The lawyers began. Mine was calm, methodical, a woman who spoke like every sentence was carved in stone. Their side blustered, talk about family disputes, tried to make it sound like petty squabbles rather than fraud, coercion, and manipulation. But then came the moment we had prepared for, the evidence. The first check was displayed, blown up on a board, my father-in-law's signature scrawled beside an account number that had been hidden. My husband leaned forward, his face paling, because he recognized his own signature beneath it, the one he had given without question when his parents shoved papers in front of him. Then came the ledger, the one they thought had been burned, produced in full by the auditors. The room shifted, whispers rippling through the benches like a gust of wind in a graveyard. My mother-in-law's face tightened, her painted lips pressed so thin I thought they might disappear. And then, the recording. Her voice filled the room, arrogant and sharp, laughing as she bragged about hiding money from the girl and how I was too stupid to notice. The silence that followed was like a blade. Even the judge's eyebrows lifted slightly, though his face remained composed. My husband's head dropped into his hands. That was the moment, I think, he realized the full extent of the poison they had been feeding him and the poison he had swallowed willingly.
The cross-examination was brutal. Their lawyer tried to paint me as vindictive, a bitter wife seeking attention. He even suggested I'd fabricated evidence. But my lawyer stood, her voice cutting through the air like glass. If she fabricated it, why did the bank confirm these accounts exist? Why do these checks bear the handwriting of your clients? Why does your client's own recorded voice admit to hiding funds? One by one, the lies cracked open. One by one, the masks slipped. I won't pretend it was easy, sitting there while they spat venom about me, calling me ungrateful, uneducated, undeserving, was like being flayed alive. At one point, my mother-in-law turned to me directly and hissed under her breath, "You will regret this." But when she said it, her hands were trembling, and I realized, no, she was the one who regretted underestimating me. When it was my turn to speak, I told my story simply. I didn't cry, I didn't dramatize. I said, "My name is Mary. I came into this family with love, with respect, with a willingness to serve. I cooked, I cleaned, I built a home, and I endured cruelty because I thought family was worth it. But family does not steal from you. Family does not manipulate your husband to hate you. Family does not break into your home to destroy evidence. This isn't family. This is abuse." My voice didn't shake. For the first time in years, I felt powerful. The verdict didn't come that day. Courts don't work like movies. No instant resolution. But we left with something almost better. A temporary ruling freezing their assets, protecting the accounts, and acknowledging that the evidence was strong enough to proceed to a full trial. It was the first official blow. The first time the system itself said, "Mary, you are not invisible." The fallout was immediate. Relatives who had whispered about me suddenly fell silent when I entered a room. A few even apologized, awkwardly, muttering that they hadn't known the full story. My husband moved back in with his parents for a time, but he began calling me late at night, his voice broken, asking how I was. I answered politely, but I never gave him what he wanted: comfort. He had made his choice when he believed their lies over my truth. My in-laws, stripped of their untouchable aura, started to unravel. The business partners they once bragged about began to distance themselves. Their social circle shrank. And while the trial date loomed, I walked taller. I had endured years of humiliation, but now every step felt like reclaiming ground that had been stolen. And then came the final blow. The auditors uncovered not just hidden assets, but deliberate tax fraud. It was no longer just about me. It was about the state. Suddenly, their arrogance became their noose. They weren't just fighting me anymore. They were fighting the law itself. When that report was filed, their lawyer dropped them. Even my husband, broken and pale, told me he couldn't defend them anymore. The trial ended with fines, frozen properties, and reputations shattered beyond repair. They lost the home they once lorded over me in, and I, by legal right, retained my share, the very home where I had been treated as a servant. Do you know what victory tasted like? Not sweet, not bitter, just clean, like fresh water after years of swallowing dust. And my husband? Oh, how he begged for forgiveness. He came to me with red eyes, saying he had been blinded, manipulated, that he still loved me. I listened. I even believed some of his pain was real. But I told him, softly but firmly, love without respect isn't love at all. And you gave up your respect from me the day you believed them over me. He cried. I did not. I live differently now. I don't cook and clean for people who see me as less than. I don't bow my head when relatives whisper. I stand in my own kitchen, my own home, and I remember the girl who walked in with love and walked out with fire. Sometimes at night I think about all the years I lost to their cruelty, and it hurts. But then I remember the day their empire crumbled in court, the look on my mother-in-law's face when her own words condemned her, and I feel whole again. Would you have waited as long as I did? Would you have endured the humiliation in silence, or would you have struck sooner? Be honest, because sometimes I wonder if my patience was strength or weakness. But I know this: revenge, when it came, was not about destroying them. It was about reclaiming me. And I did. So when people ask me who I am now, I don't say, the girl who was treated like a servant. I don't even say, the wife whose husband turned against me. I say, my name is Mary. I am the woman who stood up, who fought back, and who won. And nothing, not whispers, not lies, not pearls strung tight around a neck, can ever take that away from me again.